Ladies and gentlemen, dames and heren, sorry, I have to get the language right. You are all very welcome here to vanabbemuseum. I'm glad to see some people that I've known for some time but have never actually made it this far into the depths of the Netherlands, so it's very nice to come, including some people from Amsterdam, so that's even
oh dear.
So I would also like to welcome in particular the Black Artists and Modernism project, which is a project I've been aware of for some time because I also work with one of the host institutions. But I think it's really particularly wonderful actually and significant maybe in a time when the United Kingdom politically and economically I guess is having less and less to do with us, that maybe culturally there can still be some connections that we can maintain and open up in that process of the UK departing from Europe. So it's very nice, I think, that this conference comes together. The Black Artists and Modernism is led by the University of the Arts London and also supported in partnership with Intersectional University. And this has been a wonderful collaboration, actually, that we've been involved in over the last 3 years with conversations, particularly with Nick, and with projects that we've done here, looking at the Black Art movement from the United Kingdom, or from England, I think, largely in the 1980s, which was an exhibition we did in a series of spotlights on different constituencies in the 1980s, from Slovenia, from Spain, from the Netherlands, and also from England. And that exhibition was one that toured subsequently in England, in London and Nottingham and Middlesbrough, and I think was one that we were very proud to have initiated, and I hope, in a sense, gave a light from Europe onto the United Kingdom situation. And in some ways, the reverse is happening now, in which an organisation from the United Kingdom is looking with all its knowledge and its understanding of the particular politics around blackness and around migration to the European context. And we're going to spend a lot of time, I think, looking at the differences and the similarities between those two contexts, which I think is very useful and in a way demonstrates that despite Brexit, there is a lot that certainly we in Europe can learn from this movement. And I think one of the things that we're very excited about, or feel is important also as an institution like Van Abbe, is to reflect on the burgeoning of the Afro-Dutch movement. I think in a way there's a new generation after the late 1970s, 80s. There was a burgeoning of a certain kind of political consciousness within the artistic community that was completely squashed in the late 80s and 90s with a return to Western forms of white supremacist modernism. And that's now being challenged again in interesting ways in this country. So there's a lot that we have to learn from your practices from the 80s and up until today, and I think that's something that I hope we will investigate today. At the same time, there are differences, of course, as we know. I mean, Brexit demonstrates them perhaps more than anything else, that there are huge cultural gaps between these two zones of influence, the British and the British Empire, and the European context, which is also shares a colonial history, but perhaps that's the only real connection that we have culturally, is that the white people here are colonizers, and that's something that perhaps we can consider in our common endeavors within particularly Western Europe. So I'm very happy to introduce this project, which will look at intersectional readings of modernism. I think modernism is a very fraught word. We often in this institution, indeed, we have a policy which talks about demodernity, about what it would be to take modernity out of the equation and to see what we have that's left over in a certain sense. But nevertheless, modernism is a perhaps now historic, or I think unquestionably historic, phenomenon, but as a historic phenomenon can perhaps be looked at and understood in ways that it couldn't be when it was still a lived experience. And I think that possibility of relating to modernism in that way, perhaps not so much as the alter modern and these terms, but more as a question of a ground on which we stand, but which is no longer active, is actually something that I think is very important to do. And I think that certainly the artists that we'll talk about in this conference from Europe are people that are very connected to an idea of allowing the tropes of modernism, the ways in which modernism understood the world, to be very active in their work, while at the same time always coming from it, not from this normative position of the white male artist. And that process is one I think that is very important to understand if we are to move on to decolonize and to demodernize our archives and our understandings of history. So I hope that that will be the discussion. I'm also very happy, of course, that this, and it's no coincidence, I should say, that this conference coincides with the Rashid Areen exhibition, which opened last Saturday in the old building, the brick building, which I hope you, within the conference, there's a visit by Nick Akins, who will take you around that exhibition, which he curated very wonderfully, I think. It will also actually come to England in the second half of next year in the Baltic, in Newcastle on Tyne, as well as going to Switzerland, to Geneva, and eventually to Moscow. That's as far as we know so far. Maybe it'll go on from there as well. But it's been a very interesting project to do. So that's the context in a way in which we look at the next few days, which I'm very excited about, and I hope we will discover some things for ourselves, as I suppose learning, as I say, learning from some of the traditions, some of the British traditions, the in a way exotic British traditions that have not landed here, learning from the exoticism of how that, exotic in the sense of outside, yeah? That exoticism actually might be something that we can very much understand being reflected in different ways, of course, in our own situation. So I'd like to thank Nick Akins, my colleague here, a dear colleague here, also Sophia Orlando and Susan Puisan-Locke, who have been crucial to putting this together. Also the Black Artists and Modernism team, Sonia Boyce and David DeBosa, who are also, I'm happy to say, here. There'll be many more thank yous, I think, in the introduction tomorrow, which will be a more thorough introduction to the Black Artists and Modernism project. But with that, I would like to welcome everybody, and now to introduce Iris Dressler, so don't clap yet. Iris, it's a great pleasure actually for me to be able to introduce Iris, because she runs an institution which is one of the few. We were just talking about the fact that there's so little in Germany that we can connect to as an institution like that. We always go around, whether it's Poland or Slovenia or Turkey or whatever, but it's very hard to connect to institutions in Germany. So one of the few places that certainly I, and I think my colleagues, feel at home in that country is the Württembergische Kunstverein, which is the institution that she runs together with Hans Christ, who unfortunately could not be here. But that doesn't matter at all, so we're delighted. So Iris also founded an institution that some of you may know, which is the Hartware Medienkunstverein in Dortmund, which he directed until 2004, again together with Hans, and then was also in Dortmund at the Museum am Ostwall, which is an interesting institution, but less interesting these days than the Württembergische Kunstverein. I think Iris will talk to us about one particular project from the Württembergische Kunstverein, and I'm very happy to invite her to the stage. Thank you very much.
Here we go. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation and this very nice introduction to this incredible, interesting and exciting conference. And I'm really, really honored to be on the situation of a keynote. It almost frightens me. And my talk is not precisely about the main issues of this conference, so it is about conceptualism and its definition and possibilities of its definition, but it's not this project I'm gonna present to you, Subversive Practices, was not related in that sense to black artists, but basically to relationships between the East and the South, between Eastern Europe and South America. As you see on this slide already, it was a really massive project in terms of involved artists, curators, partners, etc. Its title says Subversive Practices, Art Under Conditions of Political Repression, 60s to 80s, South America, Europe. As you probably noticed, this is not really a title, but rather a cry of help or something like this, which is directly connected to this project in a certain way. Subversive practices is connected to a broader context also of our interest in collaborative, transcultural and transdisciplinary practices. So that means that once in a while we are doing these kind of enormous projects with 10 to 20 curators with the idea to develop on a very, very basic level polyphonic projects. Looking at subversive practices from the perspective of two major lines of this conference, intersectional readings and international framings, the basic aspect to mention here on the structural level of the project are its manifold crossroads, deadlines and derives between the South and the East, between curators of different generations, born between the 1940s and the 1980s, cultural contexts, discourses, theoretical self-understandings, etc. Curators who act themselves in between the roles of artists, writers, art historians, activists, archivists, etc., and this inside as well as outside of institutions. Regarding the artistic practices we explored within this project, they all were, of course, also related to quite different cultural, generational, discursive, etc. contexts. They were often fighting against these artists and or undermining both the oppressive political conditions they were living in and the ignorance of the Western art market centers and canons. And they were dealing with contexts and issues of class, gender, indigenous backgrounds, etc. One of One of a formal, on a formal level of the exhibition, the exhibition was based on an almost grid-like structure of 9 separate sections, with the aim to create a sort of anti-map of conceptualisms of the South and the East, whose strict separated sections offered exactly through this separation unexpected possibilities of open, ever-changing constellations of references between the different sections. I will get back to this. Our intention from the very beginning was to present a temporary, fragmented and incomplete map consisting in snapshots of various, at that time still ongoing research projects, instead of a coherent, all-encompassing narrative, whatever this would be. So it was rather an anti-narrative than a counter-narrative, a stuttering, as the title already suggested. Backgrounds of the project. The exhibition and research project Subversive Practices that took place between 2008 and 2010 at the Württembergischer Kunstverein and other places, comprising workshops, conferences and exhibitions, was based on the research project Vivid Radical Memory. Vivid Radical Memory itself has been initiated in 2006 by Antonio Mercader, at that time media art historian at the University of Barcelona and former member of the Groupe de Treball working group, one of the major and meanwhile canonized protagonists of conceptual art practices in Spain, respective in Catalonia, that were established during the Franco regime. The aim of this first project that was carried out together with the Center of Culture and Communication in Budapest and us was to establish a network of experts and an online database that collects, exchanges and analyzes works and theories around conceptual art practices or conceptualisms from the 1970s to the 1980s, generated in the South and in the East, that is more or less in Latin America and Eastern Europe, under conditions of military dictatorships and communist socialist regimes. So this chain of reference was there from the very beginning. Thus in focus were artistic practices of the so-called peripheries that were being marginalized and disregarded not only within the Western canon, but also within their own cultural contexts, due to the censorship and other repressions that made their works invisible or literally destroyed many of them. The latter backgrounds of Vivid Radical Memory, besides Mercader's personal involvement in the Groupe de Treball, surely were related to the activities of the BACBA, or rather of Manuel Borja Vilel, then still director of this museum, not only regarding the re-evaluation of conceptual art practices, but also towards a broader reflection on both Spain's colonial and fascist past. Juan Albarrán will probably talk about these contexts in the next days. Even though the MACBA was only an indirect partner of vivid radical memory, it offered and shared a certain sphere of resonance. At the time, that is around 2006-2007, the research network Conceptualisms of the South just came into being, and a younger generation, especially of South American researchers, figures such as Ana Longoni, Fernando Davis from Buenos Aires, had already since years explored new perspectives on conceptual practices from off-center context, to use a term by Longoni. Miguel Lopez, then 23 years old, and Emilio Tarazona just had presented their first survey on Peruvian conceptual art in Lima under the title The Persistence of the Ephemeral, Origins of Peruvian Non-Objectualismo, referring with the notion of no objectualismo to the Peruvian, Mexican and Marxist art critic Juan Acha. The archive of Acha, who has been from the 1960s to the 1980s a major theoretician on contemporary art in Latin America, has recently been presented in an exhibition curated by Joaquín Barrientos at the Museo Universitario de Arte Contemporáneo in Mexico City. When Lopez and Taraceno started their research in Peru on artists such as Theresa Boca, Rafael Hastings or the Chaclacayo group, they started literally to dig in the basements of forgotten artists. For them, being part of a generation of young Peruvian artists and curators that had, due to the repressions of various dictatorial and other violating systems, no access to the more recent history of contemporary art in their country, it was of major urgency to rediscover and reinvent these histories. In contrast to them, the curators of the Argentinian section of subversive practices, Fernando Davis, the curator of the Chilean section, Paulina Varas and Ramon Castillo, as well as Cristina Freire representing the MAC-USP, that is the Museum of Contemporary Art of the University of Sao Paulo, could and did refer to more historical protagonists of the discourses and practices of Southern conceptualisms who had been active already in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. For example, to Graciela Carnevale, who had been also part of Vivid Radical Memory, and her archive of the avant-gardists Rosario group, the Chilean curator Nelly Richard, or the 1960s, 70s director of the MAC-USP, Walter Zanini, and many more. When Hans and I were contacted by Antonio Mercader and invited to be part of the Vivid Radical Memory project, his basic interest was to create links between the resistive artistic practices in Latin America and Eastern Europe, including East Germany. In fact, there had been in the 60s and 70s quite a lot of connections, for example, between Hungary and Argentina, basically made possible through mail art. Like this, the first lines of what came later, that specific artificial map of conceptualisms, were drawn. In the course of Vivid Radical Memory, the wish of both, the continuation of the just established exchange platform and the development of an exhibition project became very strong. That's how subversive practices finally was born, based on a slightly shifted partnership between Trafo in Budapest, Arteleco, another Spanish institution, and us. About maps. In the preface to the catalogue of the groundbreaking exhibition Global Conceptualisms, Points of Origin, which was curated by Luis Kamnitzer, Jane Farver, Rachel Weiss, and 11 further curators in 1999 at the Queen's Museum in New York, the project initiators point out that the aim of this project was to sketch a new and multicentric map of conceptualisms, displaying various geopolitical points of origin. I think that we indeed, on a very fundamental level, need to design constantly new, divergent, contradictory, imaginary, impossible, unreadable, artificial, incomplete, shifting, unexpected, and whatsoever maps of the histories of modernity to rediscover and rewrite this still so unknown and yet so manifest planet with all its promises, failures, and challenges again and again. In this sense, we understood subversive practices basically as a construction of an artificial and impossible map that, for as arbitrary as coherent reasons, brought together things which had and have at the same time nothing, something, and everything in common. One basic point of departure here was to understand that artistic production from the so-called peripheries are not to be viewed, like Marie-Carmen Ramirez puts it, as reflections, derivations, or even replicas of the center-based conceptual art, but instead as local responses to the contradictions posed by the failures of post-Second World War modernization projects. Thus, a re-evaluation of art from the 1960s to the 80s cannot simply consist of accommodating with the existing maps and registries of global art history some of those names that have been wrongly left unconsidered. It must instead permanently involve a reorganization of these maps and registries. Of course, we need to ask in front of any map who is in and who is missing, and who is visible and who is invisible. At the same time, reaching visibility is not per se a fundament of emancipation. It can be also the persistence of staying invisible, as visibility is, of course, also connected to control. Subversive practices from the outset purposely lacked any claim to the presentation of a global or encyclopedic overview on other conceptualisms or something like that. The exhibition had its roots in a process based on various personal networks, bringing together a group of experts from a wide range of different generations, areas of interest, contexts, and methodological approaches. The research conducted by each of them did not, in its entirety, form a grand narrative, but rather expose in particular the exigency of specific and even incompatible viewpoints. As such, subversive practices pursued the conception of an artificial map whose junctures, fractures, and especially blind spots had been an integral part of an experimental arrangement for disrupting the linear narratives of art history. In alignment with the research fields of the participating curators, the nine sections introduce various aspects of conceptual, experimental, and subversive art from the GDR, Moscow, Hungary, Romania, Catalonia, a Brazilian museum, Argentina, Peru, and Chile, and fostered a temporary connection between them. The different curators, by the way, were not only given carte blanche in conceptualizing the focus of content within their respective sections and in selecting the artist, but they were also invited to develop their own presentation concept. It was crucial to us to not homogenize the projects through a coherent display, and this is something which maybe I would have wished that was, at least many of the presentations looked pretty white cube, but well, things happen like this. The spatial structure of our artificial map was based upon a grid that defined the spaces of the 9 different sections. By simply turning the center of that grid, a variety of possible passages between the sections could be offered. Here, not only a clear segmentation between South America and Europe was avoided, but multiple new geopolitical interconnections arose. Just go, I mean, I'm not now telling you which is which country or something, but just that you see that through that this is the center, the kind of shifted center that it allowed to have many different aspects and connections. This was, by the way, this was the Brazilian Pavilion, which was curated by Cristina Freire, basically related to the collection of mail art from the MAC-USP, with a very specific map showing all the different mail art projects go to one center, and this is in Sao Paulo. This was just to give you some. This was the part curated by Miguel Lopez and Emilio Tarazona about the Peruvian context. Okay. Besides being shaped by the different curatorial approaches, the 9 sections negotiated historical, political, societal and cultural context, which in many respects are hard to compare, not only between, but also within Europe and South America. These contexts were predominantly communicated through the curatorial statements in each section, as well as through the explanatory information related to the individual works. What we tried to avoid was to offer any overall historical or territorial narration. An initial cursory overview of the 9 exhibition sections already reveals the heterogeneities within these settings. 7 of the 9 sections delineated a geopolitical framework that in 6 cases referenced a nation and in 1 case a region. 1 section was dedicated solely to 1 single artist group, the collective actions, and a further section honed in on a collection, as I said already, the mail art collection of the MEC USB. The latter, of course, then showing works by artists from manifold backgrounds. The empty center on the exhibition was formed by Sabine Hensken's section, which was conceptualized as a diagrammatic interpretation of the collective actions, trips out of town. Reconstructions. One of the many complex problems of subversive practices was related to the presentation of ephemeral and performative art practices, which often had been decidedly produced for spaces and experiences outside of the museum context. These and further problems were the main focus of the Hungarian section, a collection of various case studies curated by Anna Maria Söke and Miklos Peternak. They explored ways of reconstructing and reenacting works that had gone lost, been destroyed, and or prompted questions of presentation due to their ephemeral, performative, temporal, and site-specific character. Söke and Peternak introduced highly divergent approaches, such as the scientific reconstruction, analysis, and interpretation of a missing work by Miklos Erdély, in which case they did not insist in a formal rebuilding of the original, but instead highlighted the process itself and also the gaps inherent in the reconstruction. So that was looking like this. So basically what they were presenting were all the documents that are still existing, some referential objects, and just trying in a sort of public presentation to explain what this project was about, and not trying at any moment to reconstruct the original work in any sense. On the other hand, they invited a number of artists to produce their own reinterpretations of their earlier works. That was for me especially interesting, so that they, because many of these artists are still alive, and they were asked to think themselves how they would show a work in a completely different, not only time frame, but also, of course, local context. As an example, Gila Power developed from his protest sign Forest an installation he had realized in 1976 at the edge of a wood, and that was nearly completely destroyed through censorship, a site-specific intervention for the Kunstverein's foyer. So in the exhibition you could see this is the original setting, which was a very nice work because of course it looks like a demonstration, but and this is one interesting strategy of these kinds of conceptual work. So they are working with language. They are on the signs you have phrases, but which together makes no sense. So it's so the censorship would never know, is this nonsense, is this political? So that, I mean, here in that case they said, okay, let's anyway destroy it. But in some cases that was successful, so that the censor just couldn't grab what it's all about. And then they tried one reconstruction here, which was, you see it underneath, which even tried to somehow reproduce something of the original moment. And when he made the reproduction in our entrance hall, it was totally different. So that was actually the situation. So he was thinking that this is the main part where people come in and go out, and so he just uses these sentences and distributed them like this. internationalism and male art. Male, not male. counting among the essential tactics of the works shown in the exhibition were experimentations with language, interventions in public spaces, be it urban spaces, nature areas, the mass media or communication systems, and the implementation of one's own body. The subversive potency and political relevance were expressed in very different ways, yet they indeed coincide in one common point, in the creation of smaller or larger free spaces of thinking, debate and action, which initially made possible a resistive production of art and knowledge within and at the same time beyond the existing political repression. Here male art played a crucial role, for it facilitated on a local as well as global scale the exchange of ideas and artistic experiments, and this both independent of the exclusive distribution channels integrated within the West-dominated art sector and relatively safe from censorship measures. Of central focus here were collective working processes involving a heterogeneous public as well as a subversive appropriation of a system for communication. The collaborative relationships between artists from Latin America and Eastern Europe, for instance between Robert Rehfeld, Clemente Pardin and Guillermo Dressler, can be principally traced back to male art. It was possible to send entire exhibitions around the globe at insignificant costs, as was the case with the exhibition Festival Hungria in 1974, which arrived at the CAIC, the Center for Art and Communication in Buenos Aires, by mail as a collection of ideas and proposals put forward by Hungarian artists. So they would just send a map with their ideas and ask artists in Buenos Aires to realize their project. And even in a state as isolated as Romania at that time, artists like Joseph Kirai succeeded in establishing international context through the male art scene. Dematerialization and censorship. The methods of conceptual art, male art of happenings or actionism, which emerged under conditions of censorship and political violence, cannot be contemplated independently of these conditions. Considering this situation, the dematerialization of art, for instance, as that very notion of conceptual art, also implied not leaving any traces behind. So there was another meaning to make immaterial works if you were working under conditions of censorship, of course. As Okoye Nbeso noted in his essay in the Global Conceptualism Catalogue, in regards to the question of conceptual art in Africa, what would it mean to nominate as conceptualist something that acts like, looks like, and resembles those practices, but whose chief concerns may lie elsewhere? This was one of our basic concerns, how to relook at something that looked familiar, but is not. We finally decided to abstain from simply concentrating on the definition of an art term, and instead chose to thematize the heterogeneity and divergency of resistive artistic practices that had come into play at a certain time, in a certain place, and in a certain way. Most artists in Latin America and Eastern Europe of the 1960s and 70s even didn't lay any claim to the label of conceptualism or conceptual art in regards to their own work. Some, like for example Juan Pablo Renzi, a member of the strongly politically motivated Argentinian group of Rosario, even vehemently rejected the term as a fashionable term that was said to only serve to periodically reanimate the art market and to utterly conform to the bourgeois conception of culture. But anyway, our point was that the redefinition of canonized art forms can occur through the expansion and or false appropriation of their codified terminologies, or through the actual mechanism and effects of these terminologies being made the subject of analysis. Then censorship and private spaces and the body, not really in parentheses identity politics. Due to the strict censorship measures, many of those restrictive artistic practices we were looking at were carried out in private spaces or in nature, with only a very small selected audience watching it, or even with no audience at all, that is just accompanied by photographic and film cameras. The body, as a first and last entity for maintaining resistive practices, played a central role here, ranging from an autodestructive stance to transgender enactments. The latter as a form of radical non-compliance with totalitarian biopolitics. But in my view, all these strategies were basically concerned with rejecting being identified. So very, you probably know this very heavy, it's one of the most heavy films I ever saw in my life. It's Leticia Parente who is stitching in her feet the word made in Brazil. Dan Perzowski was working with this context of using tattoos in relation to stigmatization. So the most of the artists dealing with their body, they really try to reject something instead of becoming something. This was another, from Paul Herkenhoff, another really physical and body-related project, which is for me one of the most strongest pieces ever on censorship. So he's reading he's reading the newspapers and he's cutting out whatever could be censored, and he's just eating it. And he's putting this in his mouth, and if you remember how dry newspaper paper is, you can almost, it's quite heavy. Another thing, I don't know if it's really good to see, is another sort of rejection by Theresa Boca, a Peruvian artist who, this is representing her identity. So she started to make a lot of this kind of medical tests, etc., and collecting all her data, and from these data trying to represent something like something in between a statistic and something saying about her body fluids, the blood pressure and things like this. And of course, by putting this everything totally open, she's completely disappearing. A further crucial subject in the exhibition were experimental ideas and practices of education. For example, starting in the mid-70s, the Hungarian artist Miklós Erdély developed in collaboration with, among others, Dora Maurer, alternative models for teaching art with the intention of providing an antithesis to official art doctrine. Up to his death, Erdély continued to hold different workshops in which interdisciplinary, collaborative, performative and processual working forms were investigated. The creative ideas, as Laszlo Beker wrote about this, during this period were interconnected with a utopian mentality, with ideas from the underground, and thus also with theory and practices of political protest. For Luis Kamnitzer, whose publication Conceptualism in Latin America from 2007 is subtitled Didactics of Liberation, education, politics and poetry count among the most important anchor points within Latin American conceptualism. He traces its origin, first of all, back to the activities of the Uruguayan guerrilla troupe Tupamaro from the 1960s and 70s, and secondly, to the intellectual approaches of the educator and author Simón Rodríguez, who was living from 1769 to 1845. Simón Rodríguez was the tutor of Simón Bolívar, among other things, and later published his ideas on art, politics, and education in a form which almost resembles like concrete poetry. So to explain his ideas about freedom, his Marxist concepts, etc., unfortunately I don't have an image, but they are really wonderful, and they are really avant la lettre, being very close to the aesthetics of of concrete poetry. To conclude, and I'm coming back to the stuttering. Due to the various concrete cultural contexts involved in this project, it was not really possible to speak that I'm coming to another process which made it so impossible really to even find a very clear title. Due to the various concrete cultural contexts involved in this project, it was not really possible to speak either of Latin America, which would have implied countries like Mexico or Cuba, nor of Eastern Europe, which would have left out Spain, which was also part of the project, and even grouping together the GDR and Soviet Union under the header Eastern Europe is not at all unproblematic unless one relates Eastern Europe in general to the former Eastern Bloc. This logic had been led ad absurdum by Laszlo Bike and Gabor Potaki in 1980 with their Eastern Europe questionnaire, in which they included all communist or socialist-run states, or all those that had been politically allied with the Soviet Union. I quote, "In the end, we reached the quasi-Dadaist or pataphysical conclusion that Eastern Europe extended across the entire globe." Also, the term subversion fostered discussion in the context of an exhibition focused on art under condition of political repressions. The danger appears to suggest, because it endangers to suggest that subversion presupposes a state of political violence. So that something went wrong. No, what I actually want to say is, I mean, if you call, if you connect subversive practices and conditions of suppression of military dictatorships, etc., that can be understood as if subversion would only be possible under these conditions. That's what I actually want to say. Subversion appeared, and then the question in turn, are political and societal repressions only found in dictatorships? This is the other thing, so the problem of connecting this. Subversion appeared in the exhibition not only in form of explicitly political contents, but also in forms of subtle manners being related, for example, to double-bind language strategies. And here I had already actually mentioned this example of Gila power. I mean, this, for example, many works which were dealing with language and where you never would get a real political statement or something like this unless you would read in between the lines, or just that sort of nonsense or Dada was itself the meaning to get a certain public. Before I go on with stuttering, I probably finish here, and I hope we find a sort of basis for questions and discussions. Thank you.
Iris, thank you very much for introducing what I think was I mean, in 2009, so it's nearly 10 years ago actually, but was an important exhibition, I think, within the German-speaking and European context, but also something that built upon quite a lot of work that had been done, as you quoted, global conceptualisms, for instance, which Louise Kamnitzer and other people had done before. And I suppose what I was very struck by is, and I think that hopefully is relevant for the conversations later on today, is this idea of not wanting to simply extend the map, but also to re-inscribe it, rewrite it, redraw it. And so one thing I suppose I would be interested in asking in relationship to this is, these terms like modernism and conceptualism are themselves inherited. They have a certain point of origin. And that point of origin is always, you know, we know where it comes from, and it's very provincially located. So I just wondered, when you were thinking about this, or in building up this body of knowledge of different curators from different parts of the world, whether it's Spain or Peru or Hungary, did you encounter any resistance to this idea of declaring them to be conceptual practices in the tradition, or what do you think? You can speculate a bit. What did people in these different locations understand by the idea of conceptualism?
I mean, there's if you look through the definitions of conceptual art or conceptualisms, etc. I mean, beyond the let's say this very narrow description, which is focused on the linguistic context, I think this term has been used and enlarged since it has been invented, actually, and. I mean, in the context of this group, it was not that much discussed because these were all people who were actually working with this term and trying to open up and enlarge its meaning. In some ways, I think it's a little bit like with the term of performance. If you don't know what it is, let's call it performance. And if you don't know, but I think sometimes this can be very useful because you are not too much excluding things from the very beginning, but you can. It was more not to having a problem where does it come from the term, but how can we appropriate actually. It's a bit. Like English, no? It's the language of the imperialists, but we are all speaking it, but with very different accents. And my biggest problem today is to understand the British. You know? So this could be.
Your biggest problem is to understand the New York conceptualists in the same sort of vein. I suppose we would think about it like that. I mean, I think that would be important. I think for the discussion ahead as well to understand that exactly that sort of, in a way, mistranslation from the origin is not what's being pondered here, or some sort of truth to the original. But nevertheless, that these terms can be misused in a way, abused perhaps, and in that abuse they actually become more available as sort of the English language. It's a nice metaphor. Is according to a purist constantly abused, but actually in that abuse it becomes something else that's owned by other people, and not only by the British. I
think especially in the Latin American context, it was very much the idea to politicize the term.
Yeah.
There was a bit what Marchand was right, making this reference between Spain and Latin America and saying, well, these were the ones who were politicizing the term, which is problematic actually. But there was one I would say one important drive to go to get that term and to see it in a more political sense.
I mean, there were a number of other topics, and I hope we'll pick them up in a minute. But I do think it was quite interesting to think about this question of, you identified subversive practice in relationship to governments that were overtly oppressive, and then at the end of your talk, you discussed whether this was whether this category of the relationship between dematerialized practices or subversive practices, perhaps more importantly, whether subversion is only possible under conditions of dictatorship. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, because we're going to talk later on tomorrow and Saturday about artists who are living within, obviously always limited pluralistic societies rather than the single point ideological control. So I wonder if you could. What's your conclusion now about that question of whether subversion is only possible within certain kinds of autocratic, dictatorial government regimes?
No, I mean, of course not. I mean, I think subversive, I mean, to resistive practices are always related to the context in which they're come to life. You know, I mean, it's this point. Where and also for me, subversive practices are not necessarily works which are directly saying this is a political art piece, but that can be very, very subtle. No, it's just the moment not to accept the conditions as they are, and just to and if you see somebody like Ion Grigorescu, for example, he would just photograph himself all the time. He would be very careful to use, but he had to share the place where he would make the films, and at the same time it's very, very resistive, very beautiful, very how he's almost encirculating himself and being narcissistic and making this for the future, no? I mean, because nobody was seeing that, but just to make something for the future that someone might see that, that's an enormous resistive power on that.
Yeah, and proved to be actually when suddenly it became available in a sense. So. Are there any questions for Iris, or comments, or ideas that people would like to reflect on? Yes, Susan. Do you want to use this one? Are you going to be the runner?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I wanted to pick up on the discussion around language, and I think you referred very early on and then towards the close to this notion of stuttering. I wondered whether you could expand on that. And did I understand correctly you were referring to curatorial strategy or the curatorial event, the exhibition, as a form of stuttering?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, as the title, I mean, we had at a certain moment a problem, like saying, do we call it Latin America or South America? Do we say Europe or Eastern Europe? I mean, and it's the same with the term of the conceptual. The more you are thinking about it, it disappears. And you start to say, maybe, and yeah, and then you have this incredible line of 60s to the 80s, which then at least became a little bit the idea of that exhibition, to not come up with this discourse of a new narrative of conceptual, but to say, okay, here these are very, very specific approaches that are now, that are not finished, and they share this with you, and let's see what comes out from it. But it was not at all, yeah, and that was the sort of curatorial positioning also.
Are there any other questions you would like to ask, or leading up to the next, the real conference tomorrow?
Thank you for that. I was curious about the constellation of places, of regions and countries, and how that came together. If you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. Also, this was basically related to existing research environments, if you want. So the one part was this establishing network of conceptualisms of the South, which had strong links and still has strong links to Spain. I mean, to the Magma and now to Reina Sofia. So these were starting, and they were forming. And then in Eastern Europe, I mean in Hungary, for example, that was very much based around Artpool, also very, very important archive on conceptual practices. Anna Maria Sölke and Peter Nack, who were since years thinking how to reconstruct works, for example. In Romania, Elena Pintilie. I mean, sometimes it was just by accident, by people you're knowing, by long-term relationships. I mean, when we do this kind of project, it's never like to say, let's cover the whole world. So, and obviously a lot is missing, but it basically starts with people we know, who know other people, that you, I mean, also, it's not only about the way what they are working about, but also the way how they are working. Because to do these kind of projects, you must be able to share things, and so to also to accept that a presentation will be more like like an essay or like a stuttering than a finished thesis. So yeah, I mean, it was basically when it started with radical memory, the network brought from the Spanish part, and we brought somehow the connect to the Eastern European, to the GDR, which also was related to a very interesting archive in Bremen.
I was just sort of connecting it to the question that Charles was raising earlier, also about mapping. So there's a 10th century polymath called Al-Biruni, who sort of proposed this idea that we now know as Google Maps, which is this idea of egocentric mapping, which is that you cover the world, but you start from where you are. And perhaps, well, I think my real sort of question was, where were you starting from? So, whose ego was it that was driving the map? You know, was that was that an institutional conversation between MACBA at that time and your institution?
Yes, I mean not MACBA, but basically the University of so it was the starting point there. But we had in parallel years before worked with, for example, Anna Söke and Niklas Peternak. So these were, so they were just different lines of networks coming together for a moment, and of course not representing the whole. No, just that is why we try to make clear that this is more a sort of fragmented image than something which represents everything. Also, what would that be?
I really enjoyed your talk tonight. I'm not sure I've got a coherent question, but I suppose I'm just wondering about the work being presented in a different place and what that means. So you talk about subversion, and I kind of think about subversion as a kind of unanticipated message somehow. I'm just wondering about the reception of that message. So, for instance, if a work was never meant to be read, how it gets read in another place, not the place in which it's made. Am I making sense when I say this? I mean, in a way, it's to do with this question of geography, but geography and reading, I suppose, is what my question is.
You mean how it was perceived in Stuttgart and?
I think so. I mean, what happens if you displace these activities from South America or from more socialist parts of Europe and then into the very Western context of Stuttgart?
Of course, this is of course also a problem. I mean, basically what happened is that people said that I mean, one art historian, for example, was saying something like, now we must rewrite art history, these kind of things. So there was something new to the people of obviously. There was there was needed a certain kind of effort also to get into it. I mean, to understand this different, because you were coming from one space to the other, so you had to somehow understand the difference of contexts which were. So it was for sure not a very easy exhibition, but this. I mean, the whole problem, of course, about how to import these projects to the Western context had been a lot of, had been many discussions. This is something especially also in one issue of the network of conceptualism of the South, especially in regards to Spain. So, for example, one problem is when you open up these works to Western market, and then they are still very cheap. They are going to be bought, and then they are going to Western archives or museums, etc. And this, for example, we still discuss also, like Theresa Boca is now represented by a Berlin gallery, and in the beginning still it was said, of course, they are just at least only selling to institutions, but even this is not really working. But as far as I know, there is a good solution that with the MACBA, with the Reina Sofia, so that, for example, the Reina Sofia invests money for working on these archives when they need to be preserved and things like this. But they never would take the originals, but copies. So they would let the copies, the originals in Peru or whatsoever. And I think these kind of tactics are very important to develop, so that you are not going to I mean, it's always this for me open question. Also, if you have a collection like here, and if this is having a very Eurocentric view, of course, one thing could be to open up a collection, but then what does it mean if then people from Peru need to see their works in Eindhoven?
Yeah, I think also, I mean, maybe just in response to that, Charles, I mean, just what in seeing the slides and thinking about it, it also reminded me of the fact that there was, from around 2000, I think, maybe 99, there was a series of exhibitions in Europe which tried to recoup something of the socialist practices, yeah, that were not necessarily official socialist practices in terms of the government, but were nevertheless actually quite well known. If you actually trace these things, you find that through the 60s and 70s, artists, certainly from former Yugoslavia, but also from Poland and former Czechoslovakia, and were in the Paris Biennale, or were present in certain projects. But that was kind of forgotten in the 80s when the hardcore sort of triumphalism of the West began, I think. And so then by the 2000, there were exhibitions like After the Wall. It was one of the first, I think, in Sweden, and then a lot of Balkan exhibitions, Blood and Honey from Zeeman, and Deep in the Balkan Gorges, or whatever, or something from René Bloch, and things like that. Those exhibitions, and also even internally with the East Art Map that Erwin started to construct in Ljubljana, that idea of Eastern Europe was something which somehow existed, Eastern Central Europe, whatever we called it, that it was something that was created in some ways by the West, because of course the actual cultural communication between the Warsaw Pact was actually fairly limited. There wasn't so much, so it was sort of created as a bloc culturally. And actually that's gone now. That's what's interesting. So this map that was meant to sort of create something that would shift art history in a way and say, well, there was something also interesting in these parts of Europe which were not within the American sphere of influence, were actually then have now sort of been marginalized again, it feels.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we just curated the probably poorest biennial ever in Sarajevo, and actually the system that I understand very well is that they invite international curators and they should bring money from their countries. But for Germany, East is not sexy anymore. I mean, when it was made by Turkey, they had like, I think, 140,000 euros. And then when the curators were from Austria, it was already reduced to 40,000, and we got 20,000. I mean, this is really a problem. So on the other hand, so it's put on the map, and it gets all this kind of.
But it gets removed from the map as well.
Yeah. That's the problem, of course. Yeah.
Okay, we've got Sonia and Anna and then David.
And I suppose I kind of have a follow-up question to that, which is, or something to think about, it might not be quite a question, is this idea of the tenacity of a hidden message. You know, when we talk about subversion and the fact that that message manages to travel, even though it's very, very coded. And I find that really interesting, that somehow that the power of that works is able to travel, even though it's meant to be somehow secretly kind of signified. Am I making sense when I say that? For me, that's what I'm also getting from your talk, is that there's a kind of a will to be heard in whatever route that word kind of takes. So for me, there's two sides to this question of displacement, you could say.
Not a terribly well-formulated question, but thank you very much for that amazing talk. The piece with the artist ingesting it was a newspaper, and he's South American. So immediately I thought about Osvaldo Andrade's Anthropophagio manifesto of 1921, and so it sort of opened up for me a question of the relationship of modernism, because we're talking about mapping and whether the West and modernism is expanded or remapped. And with that manifesto, there's a notion of, kind of cannibalizing Western notions of modernism and throwing them out in different ways. But also, so the question is to ask how self-conscious that gesture was on the part of that artist. And then the other question is, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, but it's just off the top of my head, the really interesting, because of the historical moment we're in now, and your exhibition was in, there's a huge amount of art historical research on modernism in Eastern Europe before the Iron Curtain, right? Yeah. So we know how enormously rich a notion of modernism was before it became complicated by the Cold War, let's put it that way. So a fantastic project, but it kind of feels like it's opening things up rather than, you know, I feel like I've got more and more questions. So I'm sorry, it's not a terribly well formulated question, but firstly, how self-conscious was that gesture, and then how do we take this kind of mapping of this period, thinking about these peripheries, how do we take that forward differently?
So this film from Herkenhoff, what's his first name? Oh yeah. I mean, this is probably more a certain kind of gesture to internalize the practice of censorship. You know, it's what he thinks. I mean, censorship is not only happening when somebody tells you you're not allowed to do this, but if you think, oh my God, that can be so he's somehow censoring himself before he's getting censored. That's my reading of it. And then it has this very physical moment of really I mean, you can really think how he cannot even get. I mean, no, as it sucks his whatever. Yeah, I mean, that project really was something to opening up. So it finally it made some limitations, like saying 60s and 80s for several reasons, or the East and the West. I mean, whatever, East and West. But it was not. I mean, the definition of conceptualism is part of the history of modernity of these discourses, but we were not going beyond that. I mean, we're not saying.
It's maybe good to add. I don't know if you know. So Paulo Herkenhoff became a curator, and he made in 1997 the Sao Paulo Biennale was called Anthropophagia. So I think that there was a huge consciousness of that tradition. That's all. Whether it was at this early stage in his career before, I don't know, but certainly he was somebody who used Andrade's discourse very, very prominently in his later career. Absolutely.
So I'm going to jump in and say this will be the last question.
You're always better than me at any rate.
No? Yeah, no.
So I'm going to be the last question. Thanks very much for your talk. I'm wondering if you can help me in some of my own thinking. It's a question about the ways in which you approach your work, and perhaps it's a question for you both, because I found your conversation and some of the interactions following your talk very rich. And what I'm trying to get at is thinking of how to think about the moment after the fall, thinking about post-Warsaw Pact, Europe, Eastern Europe, and the kinds of material that we need to use to analyse that situation. Someone said to me at one point that we need to be thinking about post-Warsaw Pact as post-empire, and that there is a value in using some of the materials that come out of post-colonialism, think about post-Western empires, in thinking about the post-Soviet, post-Warsaw Pact situation. Is that bogus, or is that really useful?
Yeah, good.
In your view, just in your work.
I think we have a response to it, so we don't have to respond. So
You have to respond.
I kind of lived through those moments in some of those exhibitions you're talking about, like After the Wall, and what was very funny, especially from a teaching point of view, was that one had just had post-colonial theory, at least one started to teach post-colonial theory in having begun in, say, like the context of, well, I mean, I'm not even talking about Linda Nochlin from Della Quarta Matisse or anything like that, but the Gulf War made it very vital. But the point was, when the war fell, the only quote-unquote theory available to apply, if you want to use that heavy word, to the situation was post-colonial theory, which was all about the other and blackness to people who were not colonized in the same kind of way and were ostensibly, you know, completely quote-unquote white. So it was very, very difficult. And I had friends teaching in Poland who were at a loss. So it's like looking at your question from the other way around. There wasn't, I mean, there still isn't in some kind of way. And of course, if we want to use the dreadful B for Brexit word, all the business to do with demonizing others has come back to haunt us. But the fact was that at that particular moment, people were also ostensibly using quote-unquote post-colonial theory to talk about the situation in Eastern Europe when it wasn't appropriate. But nothing else was there. It kind of very strangely filled a vacuum.
But in what way was it not appropriate, Ma'am? Because, isn't this what we're talking about with intersectionality? That what we need to be looking at are structures of relations, not just saying that on one side with one thing talking about black people and one side talking about white people. We're talking about structures of relations of power. And do we not need to use those forms of analysis and see what is available in those different structures of analysis in order to look at different situations and where those situations interact and intersect?
Because this is something that we deal with a lot here, so that's why people are laughing at it. I mean, and it's a huge question, and obviously there are not direct parallels, so it's absolutely about a kind of analysis. But also, I think it's important to look at a longer history of Europe rather than only the history of the period of the Soviet. What would we say? You know, I mean, Europe was divided into two interest groups, United States and the Soviet Union. So we would also have to look at Western Europe in terms of its relations to the United States as we look to the Eastern Soviet Union. But what we have to say, however, is that there are internal colonizations within Europe, which apply, interesting experiences to the Sami in the north, also apply to the Irish and the Scots and the Welsh to some extent within the United Kingdom concerns, apply certainly to the Slavic peoples, if we use that term for a moment, in terms of the Austrian and German, to some extent Hungarian empires, internal empires that were built. Now these weren't the same, they weren't the same because they weren't reliant on the same level of the transatlantic slave trade as a dominant motive. So I think we have to always make a distinction in relationship to the colonialism that's generated from, if you like, the Algarve to the Shetland Islands or Newcastle, depending where we draw the line, in this strip along the west coast of Eurasia. And I think that strip has a particular kind of colonial structure in it, a colonial matrix of power. We can think if we use the decolonial theory, which I think is more useful than post-colonial actually now. But precisely because I think the post-colonial does struggle with this idea of how we can look at comparative colonialisms. And I think that comparative colonialism is very interesting. Also importantly, as another side of it, is that there's been very little comparative colonial thinking within the European colonial empires. So one of the things that's very important to consider is that the European Union was based on this doctrine of never again to Auschwitz, to the Holocaust. It was not based on never again to colonialism, but it could have been. And that's a kind of missed opportunity, because what happened is that Germany took the scapegoat role, and now, in a sense, we're suffering from that. Because the question of colonialism was almost the only thing culturally that Europe shared in 1945. Because all the founding countries except Luxembourg were colonial powers. So that moment actually where it could have been a coming to terms with being the colonizer as the founding point of Europe and understanding National Socialism as being part of a colonial discourse, perhaps arguably re-importing colonial strategies into Europe. And that possibility in Europe was lost. And that's something that maybe we need to think about recapturing within our discourse. Yeah? I mean, it also applies to the United Kingdom, but that's now gone. But I think within the discourse here of the founding states, it's something that we need to apply. And of course, that might also be seen in relationship to that rest of Europe, which is now part of the European Union and is struggling to find its own voice within that. So I think there's huge potential in that question, but it's also a very complicated one that we need to deal with in a nuanced way.
Yes. I think exactly on that note, we'll leave it there. I'm going to be...
Really?
Yeah.
You can't get rid of your colleague.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and for the amazing discussion. I couldn't help, especially after what Charles just said, and it might sound a bit clumsy, the question, but bear with me. I've been, from the beginning of your presentation, a bit puzzled with the geographies involved. We talked a lot about Europe, I guess, but we are not talking enough, I think, about South America or Latin America, and especially in the relationship to Eastern Europe back to the 70s and 80s. And especially because, politically speaking, what we see and what you framed as dictatorships in Europe in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Latin America are mainly supported by the West. And they are the samples, the experiments of neoliberalism. So if we think about political aesthetics, and if you think about like subversion or struggle within that context, we have a picture that is very different from Eastern Europe back to the same time. And we can also add that in that context, in that relationships, or we could even say solidarities of political ideology and cultural production, we have the Soviet Union supporting guerrilla movements in the countries you mentioned, but also Colombia and others. So there's something here. And then at some point you mentioned Cuba. Oh, we could have extended to Cuba. I'm not sure about, I think you are relying on a notion of dictatorship that is a bit generic. And I think I go back to the ego of the map that was mentioned before. And I'm not completely convinced. I think I have some issues about the way in which you were connecting geographies. And this is something maybe very much driven by political relationships, but I also, probably as a question, I would like to know how far your research went to understand in terms of aesthetics, how those things were connected or not. Thank you.
Just to the issue with Mexico and Cuba, it was not about that we should have enlarged to this, but that because it was that we had this discussion how to name it, to call it South America or Latin America, or so this is why. But it was not that we were thinking we have to. Yeah, and it was about, I mean, of course, the different periods and also even the time frames of the dictatorships or situations like in Peru. I mean, had been even in between the countries which were from South America had been very different. There had been very different developments in time, for example. And of course, in Europe it was basically, I mean, it was about Franco on the one hand, and it was about also in itself very different forms of communist and socialist regimes, which were totally different in Hungary than, for example, in Romania. Even the situation for artists in Romania were completely different than for the one in Hungary, etc. And then again, concerning the GDR. I mean, that would have been probably another lecture, but in the exhibition itself, we tried to develop, I mean, this was the idea of having this section, so that in this section you could very precisely talk about the specific situation the artists were reacting on, or the fields they were working in, and in just putting them next to each other, which was obviously not possible. There were some interesting links, nevertheless, appearing. So it was like turning relationships upside down and look at them, and yeah, I can just explain it like this.
And I think on that note we'll leave it there for this evening. Thank you so much to Iris. Thank you, Charles.